dokie, well, let's continue on to our thrilling kind of ride through food and beverage. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about restaurants. Many of us have worked in them. I gotta admit, I have waited my fair share of tables for many, many years. I'm kind of glad I'm at a stage where I don't have to do that anymore. There were good parts, there were bad parts. Lots of rolling silverware. I don't know if that was good or bad. Anyways, so let's talk about restaurants first. Uh, the word restaurant really comes from the word restore, right? Or at least that's kind of the basic meanings behind it. It was supposed to be a level or a place of sort of professionalism, and for weary travelers to be able to stop. This is where we got the initial taverns and things like that, and then people turned out like them, and then they'd be social gatherings, and then we grew into restaurants. The level of professionalism for chefs and restaurant owners is rising, right? It's You can't just open up a mom and pop store on the street corner and it do well anymore. I mean, you could in some places, but like you have to have good menuing, you have to have good pricing, you have to think about your management, you have to think about your inventory costs. It's a very competitive world, and the levels of professionalism for chefs and owners is just growing substantially and quickly. And this includes having to have lots of background into multicultural cooking skills, have a real passion for the restaurant business, dependability, cooperation, initiative. So let's talk first about sort of the types of restaurants, a little bit about menus and pricing. Then we're going to talk about front of house versus back of house, because that's something that if you've worked in a restaurant, you know. If you haven't worked in a restaurant, you probably don't know. We need to go through it. And then management, sort of what are the things that the manager's actually doing. Okie dokie. Well, there's many types of restaurants, and oh my gosh, there's a lot of text on these screens. I will do better in future iterations to try to put this down a little bit. But first, just so you know, most restaurants are either franchised or independently owned. They're either owned by like an individual or a family, or they're franchised where you pay a fee to be able to get part of that logo and promotional material and operational services from a franchise group. That's similar to the case of hotels. So have you ever heard on the commercials where they're like, Taco Bell has this new deal at participating locations? A lot of time those participating locations are whichever ones are actually owned by Taco Bell themselves. The ones that are just franchised have a right to be able to do whatever promotions they want or not want. So not everybody participates. All right. Independent restaurants, they're typically just involved in day-to-day operation. The business owner's there on site. With the franchise restaurants, they may or may not be. Sometimes they hire a GM who works through all of this franchised material, such as like designs, plans, sells products, and the owner is not an everyday presence. Most experts agree that there's two main classifications of restaurants: independent and chain. So independent restaurants are ones that they're the only one of them, right? But then there's chains, and we know chains. Chains are the Texas Roadhouse, the O'Charlie's, the Chick-fil-A, the Taco Bell, oh my gosh, so many things, right? So we have independent restaurants and chain restaurants, but those aren't the only things. There's other categories that are like fine dining, quick service, ethnic-based, family, dinner house, occasional, casual, and we're going to talk about what each one of these are, but many restaurants fall into more than one category. For example, and this is an example that was given to me for this lecture, and then I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. Taco Bell is considered both ethnic food and quick service food. I don't really like that definition, mostly because like the US design and menu would not be found in Latin American countries, and most of the menu is not actually derived from any sort of Latin American communities. Taco Bell was created by, oh my gosh, I should know his name. Anyways, just an American who decided like, hey, tacos are quick and easy, and it's an alternative to some of the burger shops that we have. He opened up one, it ended up going well. It was actually his third restaurant, and his other two had kind of closed down. Anyways, it ended up exploding out. If you're ever really interested in the entire history of Taco Bell, let me know. I have a really cool documentary on it. But so it's odd that it's considered an ethnic restaurant, but anyways, chain restaurants comprise different groups of restaurants. So these might have each look identical in the market. Why does every single Waffle House look the same, even though many of them are franchised? Because they have identical market concepts, design, services, food, names. They're all under a chain restaurant agreement, typically. Okay. So let's go through what some of these are. For example, a fine dining restaurant. You know, a fine dining restaurant. These are the ones that you see in movies where for some reason, like people can afford them, and you know in real life that that's probably not true. Anyways, fine dining restaurants are ones that have a very nice menu. This menu might be based upon what ingredients the chef could get that week. It has a very good selection. Nearly all the food is made on the premises from scratch or from fresh ingredients. And in recent years, fine dining has become sort of more fun because we started to have creative chefs. It used to be fine dining was almost exclusively French cuisine, right? And now it's branched out to the point where you have like gastro science happening, where you might have bubbles that taste like something that you pop them and then you have other pieces coming out, or there might be chocolates within chocolates, or we might have all these different sort of flavors going together that we've never had before. So fine dining has really just leveled up with the rise of like food science being a popular degree for people to get. After that, we also got to think of like celebrity restaurants. So these are the ones like, if you've ever seen a Hell's Kitchens episode, or basically anything that's owned by like a celebrity chef or a celebrity, these are ones where the celebrity, who may or may not have a background in food and bev, own the operations. And a lot of the operations are designed to be entertaining and draw on sort of the notoriety of the owners more so than the menu itself. We also have things like steakhouses. Steakhouses have been declining in the US, mostly because there's been a huge like cultural shift away from majority red meat diets to having more white meat diets or more vegetarian diets. But they're still popular despite a lot of these very recent trends. And to remain competitive, many operations are adding in like value priced items. So instead of having only steaks, they now will offer one or two additional dishes, such as like chicken or fish, that will typically be on the specialties, and the price will end up changing. But this is to be able to bring in some customers and families or dates or individuals who might have different tastes than just steak. And these upscale steakhouses, such as like Ruth Chris, Morton's, for Houston's, they continue to attract the expense account or occasional diners. So people who go in for a really fancy night once in a while. Now, under casual dining, we have so many different categories. For example, family restaurants up in the top left. Many are operated by individuals and families. We know these. We've been to these many times. You go in, it feels homey. It's sort of an informal setting. They're designed to please everybody and to feel sort of like a family environment. And that's been a huge staple that was very popular in the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, but we still have lots of them now. Ethnic restaurants, this is just a blanket term that just means anything that serves food that's like non-US culture heritage. So you know, the awesome, let's even go through the ones in Morgantown: Thai, Indian, Korean, Japanese. I think we have a really good Turkish restaurant here. Like, there are so many different types of foods and cultures and heritages that are operating within Morgantown. I'm actually kind of surprised coming here. I really didn't expect to have this much variety of food, but I'm very happy that it's here because there's some great stuff. So the majority are family owned and operated and sort of like agglomerate to specific areas. Like when you go to Washington, D.C., there's an area called like Chinatown that's a majority like Chinese restaurants. Agglomerate just means locating nearby similar. So why are all the fast food restaurants always on the same exit? Because they know that people who haven't made up their mind yet are going to take that exit and then kind of figure out what's there. So they realize when they operate nearby other fast food restaurants, there's lots of people going to that area who then might pick your food. So agglomeration theory is huge when we think about restaurants, and we actually see a lot of this specifically within ethnic restaurants sort of clustering together. Like when I lived in Atlanta, I was nearby an area of like all Korean restaurants, and it was so good because the best Korean bakeries were there, but they were all located within like a half mile of each other. We also have themed restaurants. If anybody's been paying attention to whatever part of the internet I've gotten to, people are really into Rainforest Cafe lately. It's just a chain of like themed restaurants that you go into and the food's like, it's pretty okay. But like why people go there is because you literally are surrounded by like decorations that look like you're at a rainforest. And there's the sound of like rain and storms every 20 minutes. Like these sort of like themed restaurants were really wildly popular in the 1980s and 90s. That's where we had the rise of like Planet Hollywood that really focused on like having just like really cool swag from famous artists over time. We had the rise of, oh gosh, there was a theme of like submarine themed restaurants for a while. This is where we originally got the atrocity that is Cheesecake Factory, because Cheesecake Factory can't figure out what it is, but it started as a themed restaurant with a like 40-page menu. Anyway, so many themed restaurants, they're less common now. Many have been going out of business, but many themed restaurants are combinations of sort of a sophisticated specialty and then several other types of restaurants. And they generally have a limited menu, but they bring in guests for an experience, right? So they're not the like sort of place that you always go every single Friday night. They're the sort of place that is just like, people are traveling. Why does Las Vegas have the most themed restaurants in the United States? Because people go to Las Vegas for an entertainment value and then leave, right? And it's something that can be notoriety. And it's something that we've seen kind of like grow over time, but become less popular. We also have lots of fast casual. So fast casual is something that in the US we're very used to. This is the idea of like your Panera Breads or your, I'm sure there's a million others and I just can't really think of them today, your Chipotle, right? Places where you can order, but they don't have full table service. You either have to go to a buffet or you have to go up to the register, and like you don't have a waiter or waitress at your table, but you can get that food and you kind of sit and you can chill, right? These sort of fast casual restaurants, they're really big in the US and Canada, but not really in the rest of the world. So the rest of the world, that's just like not as much of a thing. They tend to have fewer frozen ingredients and are sort of like this intermediary in between like quick service fast food and like full service restaurant that is just like this weird bubble that exists primarily in North America. Then we call it quick service. You've probably heard it as fast food, but quick service dining is just basically things that have limited menus, no table service. A lot of them have drive-throughs so that you can quickly go through them and get out fast. Sorry, I got a little bit of a cough today. So sort of in an attempt to raise sales figures, they work a lot on like co-branding. That's like the ones that you see the KFC Taco Bell in the same place, or you might see A&W restaurants have A&W root beer, which A&W root beer actually got spun off to another company. So now A&W restaurants have to pay the license to, I think, Yum Foods to be able to use root beer in their themed restaurant. Anyways, so there's lots of different fast food places, and these are the ones that we kind of think of as like you can go in and out very quickly, feed your family, $20 or less, but it's not always going to be the healthiest stuff. A lot of the time because it's mostly frozen foods, because that they have good storage capabilities. Okay, so after casual dining, we have to start thinking about maybe the types of menus that we're going to be planning. So menus are just a fascinating thing, right? Because we take them for granted. Menus weren't actually given out at tableside until what, like in the 1900s or so, when printing was easier and became more widespread, and when we also got like the basics of the basics of lamination didn't really exist till the 1960s. But having something like actually handed to you at a table instead of on a board, where you would be able to look centrally, that was actually a game changer. But thinking about physical menus and how things are priced on them is actually one of the most important parts of a restaurant's success, because that's how you determine profit margin. It's how you determine what sort of things you need to have inventory for. It can respond to guest expectations. It can respond to seasons. It can respond to a bunch of other things, because your menu can make or break you. If it's too simple, people don't come. If it's too complicated, people don't come, or you have to have everything frozen in a giant inventory where things aren't really used. You can't do like hot soups during summer. They don't do well. You can't do iced coffee during winter. They don't do well unless you're in a college town, because for some reason iced coffee always does well. But your menu is probably one of the most important pieces of being with your concept and also exceeding guest expectations. This means that you need to have the appropriate level of expertise. You need to have a chef who can manage that menu and can get it ready on time and in order. And the management of this menu includes so many things, such as what you're purchasing, the salaries of different people, because if you're having them do a difficult or technically skilled job over and over, that's going to pay differently than pushing out burgers all over the grill over and over, right? Your equipment needs. Do you need to get the high performance mixer that can handle dough for hundreds of pizzas, or do you need just the mixer that can do the occasional dessert? These sorts of things are all affected by the menu. And the menu must be developed with regards to sort of the capacity and layout of both your equipment and the space that you have to put them in. So then we need to think, how do you price a menu, right? If I'm looking and I know that I have tofu, chicken, beef, veggies, what price do I put on that? How do I figure that out? Well, there's a couple things I need to ask first. First is who the target market is. Do I think that this is going to be college students? Do I think that this is going to be high-end dining? Do I think who do I want to attract with this menu? I also need to think about competition. Are there a bunch of other places that offer these 4 dishes, and what do they charge for them? What's the food cost? How much? Like, I don't want to charge $5 per plate if it's costing me $8 in food cost and $2 in labor cost and $1 on overhead costs to make this purchase, right? We need to think about profit margins and contribution margins. So we have 2 main approaches when we're thinking about pricing on a menu. The first is the competition approach, right? And this sort of refers to analyzing the prices and ranges of local competition. If I'm going to open up a burger stand, going to every other burger stand in my town and figuring out, like, are you charging $5 or $15? We got to figure this out. So to make sure that I am within a respectable range or a reasonable range. Another one is the ratio approach. So this is where we think about cost of each menu item and then multiply it by a ratio. So let's say we have a burger. Okay, we got bun, cheese, lettuce, burger, stuff, right? And this probably costs like $3 in materials. Okay, well, that's not the only cost. We also have to think about the labor cost, okay? So to make that burger, let's say it takes 50 cents of somebody's time. We're at $3.50. Okay, then we need to think about overhead, because we still got to pay for the lights, and we still got to pay for the electricity, and we still got to pay for like the salaries of people who are on salary, and we got to think about like getting new menus, and we need to think about like ordering tablecloths or whatever else. So let's say that that's another 75 cents. Okay, now we know that this is $4.25, right? A ratio is the idea of, let's say that we want to put an extra 30% on everything above cost. Okay, well, then that would be 425 times 1.3, because it's 100% of the cost plus an extra 30%, and then that equals our price. Probably should have done an easy number so I would know it off the top of my head. Let's see. 425 times 1.3. All right, so this burger needs to be at least $5.52. I'd probably round that up to like $5.75, right? And that's how we do a lot of these approaches to actually being able to price these menus. Oh, okay. Well, let's keep thinking. So when we're thinking about menus, we have 2 main categories of workers, right? We have those in the kitchen, we have those in management, we have those in accounting, we have the ones dealing with all of these back of house issues such as inventory, cook, prep. And then we have front of house, the people who are actually directly working with the guests, our hostesses, our hosts, our servers, our waiters, our bartenders, our front of house manager. So you need to think about, like, what does this front of house do versus what does this back of house do? Front of house, these are guest contact people. Servers, bus people, hostess, servers, I already said servers, I'm losing my mind today, bartenders, the salesperson of the restaurant, basically. They give the guest the experience. They interact with the guest, they sell the guest, they have to figure out what the guest satisfaction is, be sensitive to guest needs, and be able to correspond those needs to the kitchen, because I worked in enough restaurants to know that the kitchen is not always in a good mood and they don't always want to hear things. So being able to communicate stuff in between the guests and the kitchen, that's a very specialized talent, and it takes work. There's also a lot of suggestive selling that happens in front of house. Going up to someone and being like, you know what? I see that you've come in here for sushi a few times. But we actually have this really, really good nigiri roll, and I think you're going to love it. And being able to like have that conversation to sort of suggest what they should sell to what you might have a large inventory of, or what might be a higher price item. Front of house tends to use a point of sale system. We call it a POS system. Not talking about my car. A POS system is where you've probably seen them at restaurants and not even thought about it, unless you work at one and you work with one all the time. But they're these little gray boxes, right? It looks like a computer. Looks like a computer, not quite a computer, because what it actually is it's a system that each of these little computers are all hooked up to that has a centralized processing unit. What you use the POS for is you put in your orders, you put in anything, and then it sort of tracks changes to inventory. It tracks timing to the kitchen. It tracks all of these other measurable pieces. And these terminals are a way for us to be able to work together. The back of the house, oh my gosh, I just realized I have so many typos this time. I'm sorry, I'll work on that. But the back of house, these are the ones who do not have direct guest contact. These are your kitchen manager, your cook, your prep cook, your expediter, your receiver, your dishwasher, your, what is that called? Steward. If you're in a really fancy place that has a steward who makes sure that like all the dishware is nice and shiny and beautiful. The back of house, they do lots of different things, right? They don't just cook. They do so much more than cook. They focus on purchasing. They try to figure out inventory. They have to receive in the food. Why we talk about receiving so much is because receiving is not just getting your package in and saying like, peace out, delivery guy. It's receiving stuff in, making sure you have good quality ingredients, making sure everything's accounted for and what you need for the week, making sure like, you tried to sneak in this bad lettuce on me. I'm not doing that. Please give me another good lettuce. It's having those sorts of conversations. It's storing food. It's food production. It's stewarding. It's budgeting. It's accounting. It's management and control. And there's so much that goes on in the back of house that's really underappreciated in the restaurant biz. So the size of the kitchen and equipment. So if we have the industrial strength pizza blender or mixer, or the like occasional dessert mixer, these sorts of decisions, these are designed according to the sales forecast. Do we think we're going to sell a lot of pizzas or one every now and then? Do we think that in soup season, we're really going to need to be able to have multiple pots of soup going? What are these sorts of things? So think about sales forecasts and consumer preferences. So if our consumers are going to like it or not, this really determines both the size of the kitchen and the equipment that we have. Proper staffing and back of house is crucial. And the rule of thumb, and I'm going to put like an asterisk up here. The rule of thumb is that overstaffing is almost better, because understaffing means that you have very long wait times. Your customers are upset. People are getting in the weeds, which just means that they are tired and they are not having a good time and everything is going wrong. Understaffing can be very dangerous in a kitchen. Overstaffing by an extra person, this can help like break out those times, right? You have an extra set of hands for when things are tough. There is truth to the saying, you can have too many chefs in a kitchen though. Overstaffing by a lot sometimes causes a lot of anger, or a lot of people bumping into each other constantly, or a lot of issues trying to figure out who should be doing which piece. So extra employees allow for cross training and development, and the asterisk is to a point. There's eventually a point where this is no longer helpful. All right. Hold on. I thought I sworn I had more for this. Oh, guess not. All right. Well, let's think about management, restaurant management, because, that's the whole reason you're here, is to be leaders of your industry. And if your industry is restaurant, you need to know how that works. So restaurants are typically run by, we call them a GM or a general manager. Sometimes it's called a restaurant manager, especially if it's independently owned, but for the most part, it's a GM. And depending on the size, type, and sales of this restaurant, there might be more managers with more responsibilities. Not all of them will have the title manager. Sometimes you'll hear the term key holder. This just means someone who can unlock the registers, someone who can open up for the day, and that's a type of management in and of itself. So you have key holders, you have managers, you have GMs, and you might have a back of house manager, you might have a front of house manager, you might have a kitchen manager, and these managers are supposed to work on creating positive work environments to lead to employee success. We've all seen that go wrong, right? But the goal of a manager at the end of the day is to create positive work environments that can lead to your employee success, right? You want your employees to be happy and you want them to be able to actually do their job. And one way of doing that is maybe ordering differently, or maybe putting someone from one station to another station, or moving someone to a different position, or having people talk together and communicate. And that's a lot of the roles of these restaurant managers. Managers tend to use a lot of computerized systems. It's not only the point of sale system, like, yeah, they do that too. But along with that POS system, they're also thinking about managing payroll. So when people clock in, clock out, how does this go for their hourly wages? Especially when it comes to people like servers or bartenders who they make less than $3 an hour, because it's like one of two professions that you can do that in, because they're supposed to be paid in tips. You need to make sure that they're actually getting enough tips, or else you have to pay them whatever the minimum wage of the state is. So let's say that someone doesn't come into your restaurant all day. You can't pay your worker $3 for being there all day. You have to pay them the minimum wage for being there all day. So these are things to consider, and they use a lot of computerized systems to figure out this payroll, human resource information, labor management, scheduling, and sort of connecting in between this front of house and back of house, because they don't always want to talk together, but they need to. Managers, or the good ones, are there to develop teams of skilled employees and encourage the growth and success of the kitchen. And when you have success of the kitchen, ultimately the success of the restaurant. And this development program may consist of starting to delegate duties or projects to the staff. So choosing people who are really good at what they do and actually giving them the ability to do that. allowing them time to sort of explain or expand their horizons. Instead of having someone be a line cook for their entire life, let them try out some other stations, let them try out some other pieces as well. And that's really important because you'll notice that a theme, especially as we talk to each speaker that we have throughout this course, that we tend to find is that everybody says, don't get stuck in one job. Try things, try variety, try things, because that's one of the best ways to learn in hospitality and tourism is through this exploration. So what's the role really of the kitchen managers? We have the GM who's overall, and a lot of the time, most restaurants, especially once they get to a certain size, will have a kitchen manager. Well, kitchen managers, they are supposed to be in charge of projecting the sales. They say, oh, we sold 25 chickens next week, but we know that a sports game's coming in and we're going to have more people, so we probably should prepare. We should get 34 chickens this week. They deal with ordering, inventory, scheduling, and training for the kitchen staff. Their goal is to minimize waste, because every single piece of food that you have to throw away, that is a cost, right? That is going into like the negative on your cost and benefits ratio. So we want to really minimize that waste. And one of the best places to start minimizing waste is by working with the kitchen manager. There's also two components that we use sort of in forecasting guest counts, which we call covers. How many covers are we going to have today? We had 35 covers today. This means 35 guest tickets came in, right? And sort of the average guest check. If you have 500 people come in, but they all have an average guest check of $5, or you have 50 people come in who each have a guest check of $200, those are two very different situations. So we have to talk about both how many guests are coming in through the door and then how much money are they spending. So a lot of the time you'll forecast this by looking at the week or the month or the holiday schedule, kind of factoring in like, hey, is there a football game going on? Are there other things going on? Looking at what happened last year, right? So what happened Friday through Sunday of last year, and maybe thinking about what happened, right? Because a lot of that, over half the revenue of most restaurants happens during the weekend. Mondays are the slowest. This is why if you ever go to like bars in town, a lot of the time they'll have something called like service industry night, and it's always on a Monday. That's because Mondays are very slow for restaurants. People get off work and like they tend to get off a little bit earlier. They have a little bit more energy. They might have the day off altogether, and that's why we kind of call it like the service industry day. Service industry or hospitality does not have the same weekends as everybody else. You do not get Saturday, Sunday off. You typically get like Sunday, Monday off, or Monday, Tuesday off, maybe Sunday, Monday, Tuesday if you're very lucky. But that Friday, Saturday, Sunday, those are the money makers for most restaurants. There's also 13 accounting periods. So every 4 weeks is sort of an accounting period, and it tends to throw people off, but that does mean you sometimes get 3 checks on some months. So we use these to sort of predict staffing levels by thinking about the accounting period, what we think is going to happen with customers, and then what happened the year previously. Purchasing for restaurants also involves like procuring products and services that the restaurant needs to be able to serve the customers. So if I know that a whole bunch of people are going to go in, or let's say it's Sunday, right? There's lots of people who don't eat meat on Sundays. So thinking about that, okay, well, those are my customer needs, and I want to be able to serve those customers. How do I need to adjust what I am purchasing to cover this Sunday, right? So operations need to determine standards to sort of set up efficient purchasing systems. They need computerization to help minimize theft. And then they need efficient and effective systems of thinking about stock levels, thinking about how much do we actually have in inventory and how does it come in and out? Is it first in, last out? So the first things we buy, the oldest things we buy, are those the absolute last ones that we're taking out when we have a new customer? Or is it last in, first out? The last thing we buy needs to be the first thing we use. These are things that we need to think about because they differ depending on if we're talking about something like dishes and linens or if we're talking about something like lettuce that goes bad, right? So having this sort of efficient system is really important to restaurant operations. So receiving is what I said earlier, sort of the process of bringing in products and ingredients, right? It's the idea that, okay, you have your shipment come in once a week and the big truck comes off and you have people come in and they're like, oh, here's your shipment. And that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is sometimes perishable items might go directly to the kitchen, and the kitchen might look at it and say, okay, this is good, this is not good, I don't like this fish, this is too many of this type of fish, I'd like more of this type of fish. They have that sort of discussion. Non-perishable items, often they get counted and then get put into storage. The things that aren't going to go bad, like your napkins or your plates. And the purpose of this sort of like receiving process is to make sure that the quality, quantity, and pricing of what was ordered is actually there. Storage has lots of issues with it, right? Because storage and issues requiring strict controls means that we need to make sure that we have systems in place where things don't go out of date, where you don't have things going rancid. That's the idea of like, do we use the oldest thing in the inventory or do we use the youngest thing in the inventory? It turns out it depends on what we're looking at. So control of sort of like the stores or the storage area means that we need to have really good records of all the items going into and coming out of these storage or holding facilities. A lot of the time, these are mostly freezers, but they might be other places within the restaurant. One of the most important goals of any business is profit, right? Which is their return on sort of the investment. Now we have two main types of costs that we need to think about. Okay, so profit is just revenue minus cost. Revenue, very easy. It's price times quantity, right? I sold 85 plates for an average of $10, $8.50 for revenue. All right, then we need to subtract costs. Costs come in two forms. So we're gonna have to have our fixed cost times plus our variable cost, and our variable cost is depending on how much we sold. Fixed cost is what you have to pay anyways. Whether you have one customer or you have 100 customers, you still have to pay the rent. So let's say the rent's 500, right? So we got 850 for profit, 500 for fixed cost. Then we have variable cost. For each person who orders a burger, I have to have someone on staff. I have to like use some ingredients. That's going to cost me something, right? So let's say the variable cost is, I don't know, 5 cents and we had 100 people. So $5 in total for variable cost. All right. So if we have, I don't even remember what I said, 750 minus 505, whatever that remaining amount is when we have our quantity minus our cost, that's our profit. Now the profit can be used for a variety of things. It can be used for restocking or inventory or anything like that. If you're ever starting a restaurant, do not expect to ever get a check for the first 2 years because everything that you'll be making goes right back in. So we have fixed and variable costs. Fixed are the ones that you have to pay regardless of the number of people that you have in your store or the number of customers or clients that you have. Variable depends on the number of customers and clients. So you always have to pay electricity, you always have to pay rent, but like the amount of patties and chickens and vegetables that you have to buy is really dependent on your customers. All right, so managing this sort of like bottom line is really important. And the way we do that is by thinking first of our big ticket items. What's our labor cost? What's our food cost? What's our beverage cost? And then we start breaking it down to more minute categories from there. So there's a lot that we need to think about with restaurant finances. One of the most important is called a P&L statement. That's just profit and loss. It's kind of what I just went through of how much money we bring in from revenue. So how many customers served by the average ticket, and loss. So how much are we spending on costs, or how much was wasted, or how much went bad, stuff like that. So these are also known as income statements, and these income statements, they can be monthly, they can be annual. Typically you have both. They show the revenue and cost for that business. Many non-direct cost expenses are identified sort of by the category that they're in, and they might depreciate over time. For example, if you buy a giant walk-in for $45,000, it's not worth $45,000 when you sell it a few years later, right? It depreciates in value. So that's something that we need to think about, is like that depreciation as well. So there's many different types of ratios to consider. Most of these are the same, right? So food cost percentage, beverage cost percentage, labor cost percentage, they're all just whatever that type of cost is divided by the total number of sales times 100 to make the percentages work, right? So let's say that I paid $500 in the cost for food and I had $1,000 in sales. Then that 500 divided by 1,000 is 0.5 times 100. That means 50% was food costs. That's basically what the percentage is. We can do that for beverage. We can do that for labor. And that just kind of lets us know what the ratio is. How much of our cost is going to each one of these parts, right? Or how much are we really compensating for through sales? We also need the contribution margin. So the contribution margin is just whatever the sales price is minus the cost. If I'm selling something for $10, that makes me $8 to make. Contribution margin's 2, it's the difference. Prime cost is sort of the combined cost of all of the things. And when we bring in the food cost and the beverage cost and the labor cost and we package them all together and we compare that to the price, we really hope that our costs only represent about 60 to 65%. Turns out that's not always the case. That's what we would ideally like for it to be, but in most restaurants, their cost is actually like 85% to 95% of whatever they're producing. But it's very different depending on what they're producing. Some of the most expensive things are meat, are things that go bad quickly, like salads. But some of the things that have sort of wider profit margins, mostly because they don't go bad and you don't have waste that you have to be able to subtract out from this, is sort of like alcohol, right? And we also need to think about lease costs. So most restaurants, especially ones that you see in shopping centers or attached to other things, or if in the mall, they pay a lease to someone, whoever actually owns that building. And these are calculated in different ways. Most of the time, the lease are kind of scaled to square foot. So if it's a really small place, your lease is not as expensive as it is a huge place. Most of the time, there's both a flat monthly rate of, this restaurant, I charge you $1,000 a month. And plus you might have a percentage of sales. Plus I will take 5% of each of your sales. Well, that's something that we need to think about, because we're like, oh, okay, well, this isn't just $1,000 a month. This is also thinking about how much of that sales needs to be considered a cost, right? The best leases tend to be ones that are really long term. So when you don't have like a year-to-year contract, but you have like a 10-year lease on a space, because you're going to be there for so long, they're typically able to give you a deal. And we hope that the monthly part going off of your sales doesn't really exceed more than 5 to 8%. Oh, you know what? We're going fast enough. Let's also talk about managed services, because there's not a lot here. Managed services are when you have a food vendor, right? So on campus, we have Sodexo. Sodexo is the one who manages all the restaurants, whether it's Einstein's, everybody's employed by Sodexo. Whether it's the bakery, everybody's employed by Sodexo. And managed services are when you have a contracted food service that's operating each of your areas. A lot of the times we see this in many different categories, like airlines. Delta Airlines never makes their own food. They have a food vendor who comes in with their little truck every single day and delivers their food onto the planes. Same with Southwest, same with everybody else. Airlines, military, elementary and secondary schools, colleges and universities, healthcare facilities, business and industry, leisure, recreation, conference centers, airports, sports venues, travel plazas. While it is not 100% of the time that there is a food contracting company, I don't know what this light is, but it's driving me nuts. Haha, well, at least it's out of my face now. I have lots of screens and a very bright window. While it's not 100% of the time that they will be a managed service company, most of the time it is. And that just means that they have someone who comes in who is able to perform a lot of these services for them, instead of them having to, for example, the university. Why do we partner with Sodexo? Because it turns out it's very expensive to run every single restaurant, do all the hiring for it, and let them act independently, and then make sure their numbers are good, and then do our taxes at the end of the year. Sometimes it's just a little bit easier to have a company that we give a flat amount to, or a fixed amount to, and continue that service. Now, that means that quality also shifts too. So we have to think about the quality versus quantity argument. There also may be cost savings to contracting with managed food service companies. But if it lacks expertise, you really should take bids and proposals from multiple managed service companies. Okay, so managed service versus restaurants. A restaurant is not always a managed service, right? Yeah, it's not like you look at my face anyways. All right, so managed service might be operating within a restaurant, but they're not necessarily the restaurant. The Einstein's Bagels and the John Chambers School, or Reynolds Hall, sorry. The Einstein's Bagels there, not run by Einstein's Bagels, run by Sodexo. So if that was run independently and they did their own hiring and everything else like that, and they didn't have a conglomerate that they had to answer to, this would be a restaurant. If it is instead through one of these service providers, it's a managed service. Managed service operators must meet the needs of both the guests and the clients. Because not only do they have to care about the people who are going to those restaurants, they have to care about their relationship with whoever's hired them. So Sodexo really has to worry both about the students who eat there and about the university that is contracting with, wants to keep the university happy. In restaurants, you only focus on the guests. Most managed service operations, they end up preparing food in very large quantities that typically are served during specific hours to captive audiences. What that means is, your student card works on campus, so therefore you're probably going to eat Sodexo whether you want to or not. The managed service companies that work with most businesses, people on the 108th floor of a place in New York City doing stock trading does not leave for lunch every day. Instead, what typically happens is that there's a shared cafeteria somewhere and that you have a managed company that provides food. It might be something different every day, but this is a captive audience, people who sort of have to eat there because like not eating there is very annoying. But cooking in these large quantities for these captive audiences, we call this sort of batch cooking. So the volume of business tends to be more consistent and easier to forecast in managed services because they have so much experience and they have so many different areas, right? So they know how they can shift their supplies in between each thing that they need. Now there's lots of different types for this. Let's go through each one. In-flight and airport. Okay, airlines may provide meals. I don't know how many of y'all have gone to Europe. I go pretty frequently. Every time I go to Europe, I like fly Delta One, where you have like the nice little thing with the tray, and they give you all the fancy stuff. And you have like wine that's paired with your dinner by their sommelier and everything else. Like Delta didn't make that food. Delta hires the contract company that happens to make that food, and Delta like gives them the thumbs up, thumbs down on like, is that food good? It actually turns out most of these managed companies, when they're doing their bids and proposals, are like, we'll serve the best food, and the airlines are like, bet. And what they do is they send out representatives to each of these managed companies to actually taste the food, and make sure that it's going to be good, and before they choose which one they're going to service with, and that's kind of cool. But the food for in-flight and airport must be able to withstand transportation, extended holding times. Sometimes cold, right? Because storage areas on planes get very, very cold. They're not temperature controlled, and they have to meet FAA safety requirements. Okay, because the Federal Aviation Administration has a lot of rules. Okay, then there's military, right? Military food is large and it's expensive, and it's $6 billion a year that they typically spend on it. Being the managed food service company for the military is a big deal because that is a huge client, right? But for a long time, they didn't have the best quality food. A lot of this is because of service delays or the fact that there were inventory control problems, because you don't always know where all military members are going to be all the time. And so instead of the sad MRE life of 40, 50 years ago, there's been a lot of changes in military lately to try to make very good food on an affordable budget quickly. Elementary and secondary schools. Since 1946, the US government enacted the National School Lunch Act. This basically just meant, and here was the argument for it, the military wanted to have healthier recruits, so they said we needed to have food for students in elementary and secondary schools. And that's what started the sort of like school lunch programs, right? And why we have nutrition standards. So if you remember back to Michelle Obama, her big thing was changing a lot of the foods that were offered in high schools to try to make them more nutritious, because it had gotten to the point where like some weird things were getting labeled as like vegetables. For example, when I was a student, pizza was considered a vegetable, and that's why it was served every day. So this feeds approximately 31 million students across 101,000 schools. And those contracts are pretty competitive because they have to make a lot of food for a very small budget. We also have university and colleges, college food services. Like you're more aware of this than I am, but they can be residence hall, cafeteria, student union, faculty club, sports concessions, conferences, convenience stores, administrative catering, blah, 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 blah. So many different places, right? But this is a challenge because students easily get bored. If you've made it through this long in my videos, I'm not talking to you. You're probably not the one that easily gets bored. But a lot of college students, like they don't want to eat the same thing every day. They get very sick of it. They do not want it, right? So you need to figure out how do you give variety to these students, but do it for a really low amount, because students sort of pay up front and you have to budget for the entire year, depending on like what meal plans are and things like that. So it's a really tricky thing. Healthcare facilities are also managed most of the time by Sodexo, who's just the powerhouse in our area for these sorts of things. But they're very complex because they have a variety of different special needs that have to be met. And a lot of the services provided through tray and catering and vending options. So labor is actually a huge amount of the healthcare facility cost. But quick service is starting to enter. You're starting to get fast food in hospitals lately. That's a whole rant on itself. If you want me to talk about like the dining facilities of healthcare, I actually know a lot about it. But we also have business and industry. For example, like I said earlier, if you're on the 108th floor, you don't leave every day for lunch. So most of the time you have contractors and self-operators that have restaurants and cafeterias that may be specifically for your business or for multiple businesses in the building, where about 80% of these businesses have something like this. They have some sort of contractor working there because it's too expensive to really manage your own kitchen for your business that might have nothing to do with kitchens. So most of the time it makes sense to have a contractor come in, and they might have very varied types of services. They might have food carts, they might have buffet lines, they might have prepaid meal options, they might have other stuff like that. We also have leisure and recreation. So this is a fun one, right? This is stadiums, arenas, national parks, state parks, zoos, aquariums, all the fun things that you want to work at. They most of the time have some sort of managed system for the dining options. You also have stadium point of service, so vendors, concession stands, restaurants, the person who says popcorn, stuff like that, and just other facilities such as hotels, restaurants, snacks, gift shops, national parks, tournaments. Tournaments are a really big one because you don't need to hire those people all the time, right? You only have 100,000 people 2 days out of the year. So what do you do about that? So there's lots of advantages to manage food service, right? And a lot of this, if you wanted to be someone who worked in this field, let's say you really want to work in restaurants and you decided, you know what, I think I'm going to give working for a managed service provider a chance. There's some cool stuff. You might have unique opportunities to travel, or there might be professional and amateur sporting events that you get to watch because you got to work them. You might be able to go to really scenic and cool areas or interact with diverse sets of clients. And you typically have a set work schedule when you work with managed service, which is not something you get in the hospitality industry very often. There's a lot of disadvantages too. Well, yeah, you do have a set work schedule. You're working holidays and nights. You're always working holidays and nights. And you tend to lose a lot of the personal service feeling, which is why a lot of us get into hospitality, because we love providing these things. Once everything starts to be managed and they start going by the playbook, it takes away some of this personal appeal, and you kind of tend to have more seasonal or work and like less creativity. So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to working in a managed service provider, but you also need to remember that it's more than just food. So for example, Sodexo. Sodexo on some university campuses are no longer just food because they realize that there's other ways to raise profit margins by starting to branch out past that into office and mail services, procurement, landscaping, housekeeping, other things that are on this university campus. And managed service operations can sort of vary in their ratios. Labor costs are anywhere between 13 to 50%, depending on what time. And a well-run operation tends to make a profit of about 5 to 15%. There's lots of trends happening here, especially in managed services. Some are that college and university food service managers have a huge challenge. They have decreased revenues. Turns out, as someone who only bought a meal plan my freshman year because my school made me and I got the bare minimum one and never used a meal plan again, like I get it. They're having decreased revenues because the food on campus sucks and you want to go somewhere else, right? Not here. West Virginia University is a wonderful, fantastic place, and we should all enjoy the meals and the gracious stuff that they provide to us. And I really like the Asiago bagel over at Einstein's. That being said, I went to South Carolina and I went to Georgia State, and both of those schools were also managed by Sodexo, and I hated the food there. That one I can't say. So there's decreased revenues and rising costs. So what do they do about that? There's a huge balancing act happening in college and university food service. And employing students can help reduce this labor cost, but is that fair to the students? Does this count towards their tuition? Are they getting paid fairly? What do we do about these things? And students are only there 9 months out of the year. And then especially during the pandemic, we had this huge shift where most university dining went to grab and go, or they went to campus cards, they went to 24-hour service, or they started to have delivery. There's schools now that like their food service runs off of Grubhub. Like it's fascinating, right? And we're starting to see this not only in university and college services, but in healthcare, nursing home, and all these other places. So the vantage points and the playbook of managed services in hospitality have changed to the point where we're teaching you these classes and this information is changing daily. The game is just moving so fast, but I'm very excited that you all get to be part of it. All right, with that, I hope you have a wonderful, fantastic, super great afternoon and have a good one. Bye-bye.